하고만 나요. 좋아하시구나. 그래서 나중에 중간에 저희가 오늘 다 영어권에서 발표를 해주실 거예요. 그렇다면 그때 통역기를 더 많이 끼시고 이게 저희가 오늘 행사가 2시간입니다. 2시간 동안 계속 하고 계시면 불편하실 수 있어요. 그래서 한국말로 계속 진행된다라고 생각하시고 여러분이 좀 듣기 어려우실 때 통역기를 착용하셔도 됩니다. 이제 주의해볼까요? 여러분 박수 한번 하겠습니다. 하나, 둘, 셋. 이거 어둡구가 이렇게 가답이 없으니까 다시 한번 할게요. 하나, 둘, 셋. 네, 아쉽지만 제가 또 안내할게요. 두 번째, 그 다음에 자료집에 위에 영어랑 한글이 같이 번역되어 있어요. 그래서 여러분이 너무 어려워하시지 마시고 이 국제 포럼이라고 하면서 불편해 하시는데 거기 자막이 다 되어 있습니다. 대신에 화면에는 영어
회장님, 센터장님 있으면 좀 달라고.
내끼고
우리 다 여기 답을 보면
네, 오늘 이렇게 오신 분들은 여러분들에게 만나뵙는 게 너무 좋으시고 지금 기대감이 많습니다. 그래서 칭찬해 주시지 말고 많이 이렇게 생각해 주시고 응원해 주시면
이거는 통역이에요. 이거는
실제로 저희가 주말부터 좀 앞으로 소식이 있어서 오늘 행사를 어떻게 진행할까 좀 고민이 많았어요. 그래서 로비라든지 무대에서 여러 가지 이벤트를 준비했다가 많이 제거하고 담백하게 발표와 이런 간단한 토의로만 진행하려고 합니다. 그래서 집중해서 좀 잘 들어주시고요. 코로나19가 끝난 건 아니죠. 이제 끝났다, 정식이라는 말을 쓰기가 언제 쓸 수 있을까? 이런 것 같아요. 우리가 뭐 감기가 끝났다 이러진 않잖아요. 그렇지만 그 어려운 시기를 여러분이 겪어오시면서 세계의 경제, 자원봉사 사례, 그리고 그 이후에 이제 시민들이 고민하고 새로운 시대를 도입할 시간을 맞습니다. 그래서 저희가 최근 몇 년간의 저희 이루어가는 이 코로나19 이후에 우리가 안전하게 도달하는 지금 시점에서 어떤 미래를 갖출까를 준비했습니다.
무슨 말인지는 모르겠어요.
이제 준비가 다 된 것 같아요. 여러분 준비 다 되셨습니까? 네, 그럼 바로 시작하기 앞서서 준비 다 되셨으면 박수 한번 가져게요. 하나, 둘, 셋. 네, 그렇습니다. 저희 스태프 뒤에서 그 문을 좀 닫아주시면 시작할게요. 그럼 지금부터 2022
팀장이 회장님
국제 포럼을 시작하겠습니다.
아니 나는 센터장이 없고
네,
그냥 그 앞에 있잖아. 그
공개대회가
나무랑 같이 있는
모두
사람이
일어나셔서 정면에 이 태극기를 향해 주시기 바랍니다.
자기들이 받으러 가는 거 같아요.
몸이 불편하신 분은 자리에 착석해 주셔도 괜찮습니다. 네, 국기하여 경례. 네, 바로. 네, 우선 서 계시면 지난 토요일 저희가 발생한 이태원 참사에서 사망하신 분들에 대한 애도의 시간을 잠시 갖도록 하겠습니다. 일동 묵념. 네, 바로. 네, 모두 자리에 앉아주시기 바랍니다. 그 접수된 핸드폰으로 오늘 질의응답을 먼저 이렇게 하실 분이 계신지도 보내놨어요. 그리고 자료집도 미리 사전에 드렸더니 의외로 오늘 토론 내용보다도 아마 그 이태원 지금 참사에 대해서 어떻게 대응할 것인가 이런 질문을 많이 입혀서 제가 좀 이따가 이렇게 쭉 스크린하면서 저희가 대답할 수 있는 부분인지 오늘 좀 번외의 질문인지는 좀 가려서 토론 내 이야기를 드리도록 하겠습니다. 네, 오늘 이 귀한 시간을 준비해 주신 분들을 먼저 소개해 드리려고 합니다. 우선은 멀리서 와주신 그래도 발표자분을 먼저 소개해 드릴게요. 자원봉사 센터 외에 3개 자원봉사 단체 협의가 있습니다. 그곳에 사무총장님을 역임하고 계시고요. 네, 미국에서 여러분을 뵙고자 왔습니다. 니콜 씨님 소개해드려도 될까요? 네, V로 지금 사진 찍고 계셨는데 박수 한번 부탁드리고요. 동시통역기를 빼셨나요? 제가 춥지 않으세요? 이렇게 여쭤보니까 퍼펙트. 우리 자원봉사자 많이 오신 것 같은데 어떠세요? 또 퍼펙트. 그래서 오늘 내도록 저한테 지금 퍼펙트하고 너무 좋다고 말씀하셨는데 이 2시간 동안 여러분이 좋은 기운을 많이 들었으면 좋겠습니다. 이번에 영남대학교 새마을국제개발학과 석사 과정 중인 강골 프라타나님으로 소개해드릴 것 같아요. 네, 한번 뒤로 인사 부탁드리겠습니다. 네, 감사합니다. 또 이번에 사례 발표를 또 해주실 분은 인도네시아 내부 데이터 관리자로 근무하고 계시고 현재 영남대학교 공공정책 리더십 학과에서 석사 과정입니다. 한티르 아유님 소개해드릴게요. 여러분 아이유보다 예쁜 아유님이라 불러주시면 된답니다. 솔직히 많아서 꼭 기억하겠습니다. 저희 내비푸드로는 대구광역시 행정부 자치행정과 이은하 과장님 소개해드리겠습니다. 이번에 공동주관하고 있던 대구자원사 포럼 정연회장님 소개해드리겠습니다. 그리고 대구광역시 자원센터 정연센터장님 공동주관으로 지금 하고 있습니다. 많은 포럼 회원분들이 참석해 주셨는데요. 포럼 회원분들 어떻게 보면 여기 오신 분들도 다 회원이시겠지만 제가 부회장님 분들만 소개해드리겠습니다. 네, 친절 청결 교육협회장을 역임하고 계신 김세환 부회장님 소개해드리겠습니다. 제가 직전회장님을 먼저 소개드렸는데 죄송합니다. 지난번에 TRL 복지성계 대표위원님 맡고 계시죠. 포럼의 직전회장님 배교 회장님 소개해드리겠습니다. 사회복지법인 금화복지재단 대표이사님이셔 포럼의 부회장님이십니다. 소개해드리겠습니다. 영남대학교 새마을국제개발학과 이재모 교수님, 부회장님도 활동하고 계십니다. 그리고 이사님 중에 성일건설 대표 이종호 대표님 이사님으로 참석해 주셨죠. 박수 한번 부탁드릴게요. 그 다음에 저희 부근자원사 센터장님 많이 참석하셨는데 살짝 일어나서 일괄분한테 인사만 부탁드리겠습니다. 저희 8개 부근자원사 센터장님 함께 하셨습니다. 자리에 곳곳에 계셔서 박수 한번 부탁드리겠습니다. 그 다음에 저희가 오늘 오신 분들은 사회복지기관의 기관장님들도 보시는 것 같고 또 기업에서도 오셨고 대학의 또 자원사 관리 담당자님들도 많이 오셨습니다. 그리고 또 자원봉사 대상 역임하시는 분들 늘 저희가 내년으로 모으시고 보시고 계시죠. 그리고 또 지역에서 활동 많이 하시는 자원봉사 대표님들 참석하셨습니다. 이렇게 말하면 어떤 분이 나가시면서 그러세요. 저 대표 아닌데 근데 저희에게는 여러분이 다 대표로 이렇게 소개해드리니까 부담 없이 오늘 함께 해주시면 좋겠습니다. 네, 오늘 그 첫 번째 순서로 저희 축사 말씀을 드리려고 합니다. 네, 오늘은 국제 포럼을 열 수 있도록 행정적, 재정적 지원을 아끼시지 않는 대구광역시의 행정부 이은하 자치행정 과장을 모실 텐데요. 이분의 모습이 자원봉사의 모습이라고 저는 생각해도 됩니다. 네, 담담하시고 멋지고 네, 활기찬 대구 자원봉사의 모습 그대로 저희가 이은하 과장님을 모시려고 합니다. 예, 앞에 인사말 때 부탁드리도록 박수 한번 부탁드리겠습니다.
네, 안녕하십니까. 대구광역시 자치행정 과장 이은하입니다. 예, 오늘 77번째로 우리 대구 자원봉사 포럼을 개최하게 된 것을 진심으로 축하드립니다. 먼저 우리 지역 자원봉사 활성화를 위해서 늘 고민하시고 또 오늘 이 소중한 자리를 마련해 주신 우리 정명의 대구 자원봉사 포럼 회장님 그리고 정연욱 대구시 봉사센터장님 그리고 자원봉사에 대한 애정을 가지시고 오늘 이 포럼에 참석해 주신 여러분께 진심으로 감사드립니다. 이번 포럼은 특별하게 국제 포럼으로서 기조 강연을 위해 멀리 해외에서 저를 방문해 주신 세계 자원봉사 단체비의 IAB의 니콜 시들로 이사님께도 깊은 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 여러분들께서도 다 알고 계시겠지만 지금 우리나라는 이태원 참사로 인해 크나큰 수준에 빠져 있습니다. 이렇게 엄청난 재난 상황에서도 우리 자원봉사자들은 어김없이 현장에서 도움의 손길이 필요한 사람들을 위해서 다양한 방법으로 노력해 주시고 계실 겁니다. 코로나 상황에서도 그랬습니다. 우리 대구자원봉사는 비대평가 온라인 등 기존의 틀에서 벗어나서 새로운 방식의 자원봉사 활동으로 자원봉사의 영역을 확장해 나가면서 자원봉사의 또 다른 발전 가능성을 보여주었습니다. 이러한 시점에서 이번 포럼이 코로나 팬데믹 이후에 자원봉사 참여 문화에 대한 구체적인 시각을 서로 공유하고 앞으로 나아갈 방향을 함께 고민해보는 의미 있는 시간이 되길 바라면서 포럼에 참여하신 분들의 고견을 통해서 대구 자원봉사의 발전을 위한 해답을 찾아나가는 소중한 자리가 되기를 바랍니다. 감사합니다.
네, 공동주관으로 주최되고 있습니다. 대구 자원봉사 포럼 정영 회장님의 인사 말씀 먼저 듣도록 하겠습니다. 네, 무대로 모시겠습니다. 박수 부탁드리겠습니다.
가을날에 여러분들 이렇게 좀 좋은 분위기에서 여러분들께 대해서 반갑습니다만은 문어머 시대의 자원봉사를 어떻게 할 것인가 하는 문제는 현재 우리의 가장 소중한 자료이기도 합니다. 우리의 이 고민을 쉽게 들어주신 이퀄 회장님, 우리가 생각할 때 이 리콜이라는 이름이 재미있어서 제가 리콜 하면은 다시 오세요. 이렇게 얘기했어요. 리콜. 어쨌든 우리가 필요합니다. 좋은 의견 주십시오 하면은 또 오실 것으로 믿고요. 그리고 인도네시아, 그리고 네팔에서 오신 공부하는 분들까지 참여해서 세계 각국의 자원봉사를 어떤 식으로 우리가 풀어나가고 협력할 것인가를 생각하는 좋은 시간이 되실 줄 믿습니다. 이 프로그램을 위해서 늘 도와주시는 대구시 이은하 과장님, 그리고 누구보다 현장에서 열심히 자원봉사에 대해서 걱정하시는 우리 정연우 대구시 자원봉사 센터장님 모두 분께 깊은 감사를 드리고, 제가 잠깐 빠진 것 같아서 이 포럼에 박찬현 이사님 오셨어요. 박찬현 이사 잠깐만 일어나가 주세요. 이렇게 인물이 좋은 분을 건강하시고 자원봉사 현장에서 좋은 지식 전달의 시간이 되기를 바랍니다. 감사합니다.
다음은 저희 대구광역시 자원봉사센터 정연우 센터장님의 인사 말씀 듣도록 하겠습니다. 여러분 박수 부탁드립니다.
오프닝 멘트를 시작하면서 오늘 같은 날은 좀 마음이 좀 그렇죠. 어쨌든 그저께죠. 토요일날 그리고 어제 우리 유가족들 얼마나 아프시겠습니까? 어떻게 이태원 사고에 대한 우리 희생자들과 그리고 유가족들께 깊은 애도를 표합니다. 지금 현재 그 상황 속에서 오늘 2시 기점으로 해서 정부는 자원봉사자들이 주축을 하는 합동분향소가 설치되었습니다. 대구도 오늘 5시에 유도관이잖아요. 항상 대구는 또 분향소가 유도관입니다. 그래서 5시에 설치가 됩니다. 저도 5시 반까지 행사 마치면 바로 가야 됩니다. 그래서 또 자원봉사자들에게서 그분들이 어떤 이 노력으로 함께합니다. 그분들 특히 우리 모두의 자식들이잖아요. 우리 모두의 국민들이지 않습니까? 그래서 함께 설파합니다. 먼저 오늘 이 국제 자원봉사 포럼, 그러니까 대구 자원봉사의 자원봉사 포럼에 보시면 되겠습니다. 아시겠지만은 대구는 이러한 어떤 이 포럼, 이 국제의 세계적인 리더들 내지는 전가를 초청해서 이러한 이 포럼 내지는 세미나 등 시포지엄을 가졌었습니다. 근데 코로나 팬데믹이 오면서 어려움이 있었지요. 그럼에도 불구하고 이번에 이제 완화되면서 여러분 아까 우리 사회자께서 말씀 주셨습니다만 세계의 자원봉사 단체 협의회 그러니까 IAV라는 유엔사가 있습니다. 그러니까 제가 알기로는 130개 이런 나라의 자원봉사자들을 위한 그 단체 집합체라고 보시면 됩니다. 아주 왕성한 활동하고 있고요. 이 단체에서 모든 세계인들도 우리한 국제가 곳곳에 자원봉사 활동이 지금 이루어지고 있다. 이 단체가 꾸준히 지원하고 있고 이런 어떤 세미나 등 여러 어떤 프로그램을 통해서 촉진시키고 있습니다. 정말 이 행사에 깊게 와주신 여러분들께 진심을 감사드리면서 아까 좀 말씀드렸습니다만 오늘 이 행사도 우리 펩시의 후원 없이는 어렵죠. 이현아 과장님 감사드립니다. 그리고 함께 공동 주관하고 있습니다만 정영래 회장님, 정우표 회장님, 그리고 우리 부회장님들, 우리 이사님들 다 감사드립니다. 여기 지금 현재 아까 우리 내부 소개한 못해드렸습니다만 자원봉사 우리 단체 대표님들, 회장님들, 그리고 임원님들 다 계세요. 정말 감사드립니다. 여러분 얼마 전에 또 농수산물 도매시장에서 화재 사건이 있었잖아요. 저는 거기 감동의 자리, 그러니까 사고 자체는, 화재 사고 자체는 재난입니다. 재난이잖아요. 재난은 다 고통스럽고 슬픈 거예요. 그런데 그 극복의 현장에 보면요, 굉장히 희망이 있는 거예요. 다시 우리는 뭔가 이런 극복할 수 있는 어떤 특별한 어떤 메시지가 있는 거예요. 그게 뭐냐면 자원봉사자의 그들의 활동입니다. 제가 그날 하자마자 바로 이제 갔었죠. 가보니까 놀랍게도요. 자원봉사단이 바로 세팅되어서 활동하고 계신 거예요. 우리 북구센터에 센터장님한테 여쭙습니다. 저는 10조 이렇게 하니까요. 북구자원센터에 등록되어 계신 맨 거기 도매시장 봉사단이에요. 그분들이 과거에 여러분 그것도 화재 한 맞았잖아요. 세게 났습니다. 그때 많은 자원봉사자들 함께 가서 도와드렸잖아요. 그때 그 감동으로 이 자원봉사단이 조직되었는데 이번에 그렇게 하더라고요. 그러면서 상당히 감동 메시지 있었습니다만 이런 어떤 분들 곳곳에 자원봉사는 그냥 있지는 못합니다. 우리 이제 사고는 우리 이태원 사고는 토요일날 밤 10시 한 반쯤 되지만은 사고 자체가 굉장히 확장되는 어떤 상황은 1월 새벽이었잖아요. 우리는 벌써 자원봉사의 긴급 조직은 작동됐습니다. 이런 어떤 이 재난을 대비하는 통지 자원봉사단 하나 활동하는 거거든요. 이렇게 한다는 거예요. 이게 바로 우리 자원봉사의 힘이다 생각됩니다. 오늘 우리 주제가 뉴노멀 시대의 자원봉사 고민이잖아요. 뉴노멀, 그러니까 새로운 어떤 기준이 되는 거, 새로운 정상과 새로운 일상이 되는 거, 표준이 되는 것을 이야기하는 겁니다. 지금 여러분 아시다시피 완전 빅데이터 내지는 AI 등 아니면은 어마어마한 알고리즘들이 완전 활동하고 있는 거예요. 이 시대에 우리 자원봉사 어떻게 할지 이 고민이거든요. 그래서 오늘 우리 세계적 리더인 전문가인 실도를 우리가 초청하게 된 거잖아요. 오늘 이 자리에서 그 한 해답을 좀 가져갔으면 좋겠습니다. 먼 길 와주셔서 진짜로 감사합니다. 미국에서 오신 거거든요. 세계적인 우리 아까 제가 말씀드린 대로 thank you. 네. thank you. 네. 이걸 thank you. 그리고 함께 또 사례 발표해 주시는 네팔인데요. 당골이나 네팔 thank you 당골. 네, 근데 당골인데 이분이 지금 영남대학교에서 이런 석사 과정이 있습니다. 오늘 와서 사례 발표해 주셨고, 그 다음에 우리 인도네시아외 가유, 가유, 네, 오늘 또 이렇게 사례 발표해 주십니다. 뭔가 이렇게 물구슬을 맞춘 것 같지 않아요? 자연스럽게 다른 거 필요 없습니다. 오직 자원봉사를 위한 고민들, 그러한 어떤 우리 열정들이 모여서 이렇게 해야 된다 보시면 되겠습니다. 여러분 어떤 기쁜 시간 되시고요. 끝까지 함께 해주시면 감사하겠습니다. 고맙습니다.
감사합니다. 우선은 오늘 여러분이 이 발표 기조가면 그 사례 발표를 들으시면 많이 나올 키워드를 제가 좌우에 뽑아놨어요. 뉴노멀 자원봉사라는 단어에서 우리가 포용한다, 포괄적이다, 지역성, 더 밀착성이죠. 그리고 디지털, 협력관계. 그 다음에 리더십 전환이라는 것에 아마 이 키워드가 니콜 사무총장이 많이 언급하실 것 같아요. 변화, 협력, 가치 주고, 지지, 발전. 우리가 자원봉사 자체는 사회에 대한 이해가 있어야 될 것 같아요. 그래서 오늘은 새로운 사회 문화 어떻게 바뀌는가에 대해서 첫 번째 이어가도록 하겠습니다. 우선 준비되셨으면 첫 번째 주제 발표 해주실 니콜 사무총장님을 무대로 모시도록 하겠습니다. 화면에 이제 PPT로 발표를 하시다 보니 앞에서 이렇게 발표하시면 좋을 것 같아요. 여러분 박수 한번 부탁드립니다.
안녕하세요. Sadly, that will be my only Korean during this speech, but it is an important word, and my apologies for not being able to speak your beautiful language. May I also offer my condolences to you and your country. Every country knows tragedy, so every country knows your hearts and sends warm wishes and sympathies for the pain that you are feeling. I used to visit Itaewon many times back when I was younger, and I haven't been in, I would say, almost 30 years. But on Saturday afternoon, I went back to Itaewon, and I rediscovered some of the places that I had remembered, and very fondly visited that location. I left, obviously, many hours before, but it is very heavy on my heart as well, and I offer condolences not just for my country, but from around the world. As Director Lee has said, and others, it is in these times of sorrow where we most and best understand the power of volunteers, people who run towards tragedy and crisis without being asked, to lend a hand and to lend a heart. And so while this issue is of utmost sadness, it is also one to remember as you go through today the power of volunteering. I want to, before I begin, issue my thanks to the Daegu Volunteer Center, the Daegu Volunteer Forum, and the Daegu Metropolitan Government. Thank you for having me. I actually didn't come quite so far. I live in Massachusetts, in the United States, but I've just come from Ayabe's World Volunteer Conference, which was held in Abu Dhabi just last week. So while I did come a distance, it wasn't as far as coming from the United States. And coming from the World Volunteer Conference, I am so excited and more excited than I've ever been about the power of volunteering. So I'm happy to share some of these insights that I learned during the conference and over this past year. Let me begin by showing you this slide. It can say far better than I can the power of volunteers. This slide is from a city in eastern China in 2021. And you can see that on January 21st, the orange line, it shows the number of COVID-19 volunteers who came forward to help in the COVID-19 pandemic. When the pandemic began on January 21st, there were just 9 volunteers who were working on COVID-19 out of 20,000 volunteers in that country. But as the virus swept across China and the daily COVID-19 rate rose to its peak, more than 20,000 COVID-19 volunteers a day were involved in COVID-19 relief efforts. And that rate remained at 20,000 until the viral curve began to flatten. These are people who rushed to help, who rushed towards the problems, rushed toward the need they saw, to help people they didn't even know. And this graph would look the same in Korea. I've read about Daegu's volunteer efforts during the pandemic. In my country, in just about every country around the world, volunteers were what saved lives and delivered valuable services during the pandemic. That is indeed something to celebrate for all of us. Let me tell you a little bit about my organization, IAVE, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about some research that we did on volunteer organizations in over 137 countries. And then I'm going to tell you about the 6 global trends that this research points to. First of all, IAVE is an international organization, and our mission is to help volunteer leaders. And by volunteer leaders, I mean each and every one of you. People who care about volunteering and people who practice volunteering in their communities and their countries. We help those leaders by being advocates, by making sure that there are laws, policies, and a voice for volunteers in the country and around the world. We must always remember that volunteering is not necessarily accepted in every country, because volunteering raises awareness of challenges. And maybe there are some governments around the world that get threatened by this. So part of our role is to be advocates and to make sure that we are assisting those volunteers all over the world in order to do what they do and to practice safely and receive the recognition for that work. We also produce knowledge, research. We are a think tank, and best practices to help people, again, learn from one another across the globe. And we have what we call leadership networks. We have the Global Network for Volunteer Leaders. We have, Korea is a member. And these are organizations around the world. We have over 97 of them that are responsible for volunteering in their country. They're responsible for making sure the volunteers have what they need, that they are accepted by their governments, that they are celebrated, and that their capacity is built in order to do what they do. At the center of the Global Network for Volunteer Leadership, again, we are advocates, we develop their capacity to lead, we develop the knowledge, and we develop their innovation. Let me pause just a moment on innovation. Many, many good ideas come from anywhere. And part of what we feel our role is through this network is to make sure we're identifying those good ideas and passing them on so that others around the world don't need to, as we like to say, reinvent the wheel. That they can take a good idea that's happening from Canada or Sierra Leone or Uganda and really understand that and begin to scale that in their own country. Why leadership networks? Well, I'll tell you. I like to show this slide because I think it makes me look a little smarter than I am, but it's from the early days of the internet, and it's called Metcalfe's Law. And basically what it says is, the more people who use a network, the greater that benefit to each individual becomes. And I think you've all experienced this. When you do something by yourself, you can derive certain benefits. But when you look around a room like this, and you see lots of other people doing what you do, you have more support, and you are able to face the challenges that you face in volunteering with a greater support system. Networks are really important, and which is why we developed the Global Network for Volunteer Leaders. Because volunteering can get hard, it can be lonely, and it can be very difficult sometimes to keep going in the midst of challenges. But being in a network allows you to lean on others, whether it's in your country, in your community, or around the world. And we feel that's extremely important. So, let me get into the research a little bit, and I'm happy to answer any questions later about IAVE. But I really do want to focus on the global areas. So what we did in IALE last year, in 2021, we surveyed over 137 volunteer organizations in countries, 137 countries, volunteer leaders in those organizations, about how they were doing during COVID-19. And we call our research disruptive innovation because we must remember it isn't just a pandemic. It is also a climate crisis, as we all know. And it is also this emerging issue of inequality that we are suddenly aware of everywhere. That we don't treat people the same around the world. And we're beginning to really recognize that and ask ourselves questions about equity and inclusion around the world. And so that's why we call this a triple crisis. Because again, it was difficult enough with the pandemic, but there was also the climate crisis and understanding this issue of inequality. I'm just going to read some words here, but you can all move yourselves back to February, March of 2020, and remember those feelings each and every one of you had about the COVID-19 crisis. Organizations were flipped upside down. That response came from Italy. It was intense, exhausting, and heartbreaking. That response came from a volunteer leader in Peru. There was panic, buying, panic everywhere, particularly for underprivileged groups. That came from our member in Hong Kong. The African experience. There was inadequate health care throughout the continent, and the kind of resilience that was exhibited by volunteers and volunteer organizations was immense. So this research, as I said, spoke to 137 people, and let me tell you what we found. We found that volunteer leaders in these countries were transformative. Everyone had to change. But these leaders took the opportunity to not just survive the pandemic, but thrive through the pandemic. They developed a culture of collaboration. They practiced what we call values-driven advocacy. They took the crisis as an opportunity to support and develop organizations in their country. They showcased innovation, and they led lasting change. I'm going to go through each and one of these very quickly, but just to say this happened everywhere. In 137 countries, but in every country across the world. Volunteer leaders like yourself saw what was happening, didn't wait for instructions, but jumped right in to become those transformative leaders. All right, let's take this first one. Those transformative leaders adapted what we call a culture of collaboration in growth of partnerships and coalitions. So they were practicing and doing their work by themselves, and maybe they were doing a good job. But the pandemic made them look around at others and other organizations. And it made them realize that if they wanted to go far, and if they wanted to thrive during the pandemic, they needed to create meaningful collaborations and partnerships. This is one of the greatest learnings, that we are no longer able to solve these problems alone, that we must form partnerships in order to survive through climate change, thrive through the pandemic, and thrive through inequality. These organizations, VLO, Volunteer Leadership Organizations, again like yourselves, increased their partnership and even cross-sectoral. So many of them found partnerships with hospitals or schools, people they had never worked with before. Again, because they saw a problem, and instead of thinking the way they used to think, they suddenly realized they needed to form a greater approach to partnership. And I'm quite excited about the second one, and that these decision makers, these volunteer leadership organizations, educated decision makers. I think all around the world, volunteering is not appreciated for the power and the resource that it is. The Sustainable Development Goals will not be fulfilled without volunteers. The Secretary General of the United Nations has issued that statement. And yet, how many of us, when we volunteer, have struggled to have our efforts recognized and to have our efforts supported and realized? I know across the world, I hear from people everywhere saying, I don't think volunteering is yet understood or appreciated for the value it provides as an essential part of a kind and civil society. Well, during the pandemic, volunteer leadership organizations got an opportunity to change that narrative. They spoke to government officials and they spoke to private sector entities, and they started to forge that narrative of volunteering as a valuable part of the response to the pandemic. And why is that important? In addition to the fact that it recognizes volunteering, it really also speaks to what we call a civil society, right? Volunteers build bridges because they work with government, they work with the private sector, they work with every single organization or stakeholder in the community. And between those, it's like they create a web, and they can really start to build those relationships. Volunteerism also provides and shapes our own human development, because when we get involved in volunteering, we start to see the issues in a different way. And we start to really understand, and we start to think of solutions to them. In other words, we really get involved in our civic participation. And by partnering with governments and with the private sector, volunteers can ensure a more responsive outcome to community needs. This really is why that strong partnership between government and the private sector with volunteer leaders is so important. And during the pandemic, that really thrived. Okay, I'm going to talk about a second finding of this research, and that's what we call values-driven advocacy. The COVID-19 context created momentum for volunteer leadership organizations to showcase the value of volunteer work. Again, what I was saying earlier, how it's not always, as we like to say, top of mind in the response to issues or in being valued as a component of a strong civil society. COVID-19 changed that. All across the world, volunteers rushed in. And in Korea, just as anywhere around the world, the same thing. They delivered food, they delivered comfort, they delivered tutoring online, which we'll hear about in a second. They responded and did things that maybe governments and the private sector weren't ready or capable yet of doing. Because volunteers, after all, are our neighbors, our families, and our friends. And I remember even in my neighborhood getting a piece of paper that said, what do you mean? We're a group of volunteers who are able to provide services. Volunteers did that during COVID-19. And they became a catalyst and the go-to organizations and catalysts for advocacy around volunteering. And really making sure that volunteers were at the table when Build Back Better, Build Back situations were being discussed. So that when we were talking about the next pandemic, or what we were going to do about the next crisis, or the next tragedy, volunteers suddenly got seats at that table. And that they could bring the perspective of volunteer organizations into that crisis. 88%, again, across the world, of these volunteer or leadership organizations said that creating an enabling environment for volunteering became a higher priority. This phrase, enabling environment, is one the United Nations uses. It's one that has become a code for an environment that works for volunteers, an environment in which they are safeguarded, an environment in which they are celebrated, an environment in which they can practice volunteering with greater numbers and greater impact. During the COVID-19 pandemic, volunteer leadership organizations increased that enabling environment. Again, largely due to the appreciation from government and the private sector for what they do. I am also delighted to report that 44% of these volunteer leadership organizations participated in vaccination campaigns, meaning that they received the recognition from their government to be able to be a part of those critical campaigns. And the only reason that number is less than half is because, remember, this is a global study. So vaccines were not accessible globally. They were not accessible, and also there was a significant amount of vaccine hesitancy around the world, which is why that's only 44%. Okay. The other part of advocacy was this notion of advocating for inclusiveness. COVID-19 highlighted inequalities in the treatment of volunteers. Again, this is everywhere. It really brought up this idea that not everybody is able to volunteer the way we have structured. If we're structuring a volunteer activity in the middle of the day, or if we're structuring a volunteer activity where you need a car, or you need transportation, or if we're structuring a volunteer activity that requires that we attend every week, that's not an inclusive volunteer system. And COVID-19 really lifted this idea that people everywhere want to volunteer. Every single person wants to mean something, and wants to matter, and wants to give back. But many communities are not able to participate in the systems that are set up. And COVID-19 really highlighted this. And this notion of what we call episodic volunteering, this really became evident. That 20, 30 years ago, you would volunteer at an organization on Mondays from 3 to 5 p.m. And you'd go every Monday from 3 to 5 p.m. And that was wonderful. But our world has changed. And not everybody can do that. And what we're seeing, and it's not just young people, it's young people and all people, don't want to sign up for that kind of commitment, but they do very much want to volunteer. So our volunteer systems have to be what I call nimble enough to take volunteers who get excited about something. Maybe they only have an hour, and maybe it's only that hour, that very hour. And our systems need to change to take up what we call this episodic volunteering. Okay, the other difference that I want to highlight is this notion of inequality around international and local volunteering. I don't think this is an issue so much in my country. I don't think it's an issue so much in Korea. But it is an issue all around the world, in developing countries, particularly on the continent of Africa, when we are used to sending people from wealthier countries to those countries as experts to volunteer. And this notion, I think, because those volunteers were kept because of safety issues, volunteers from the United States, Canada, or Korea, or India, or excuse me, the UK were prevented from going into these countries because of safeguarding issues and the inability to enter countries during COVID. The local community volunteering centers that were already there in countries like Uganda, Sierra Leone, they started to have this attention put on them from their own governments, who said, oh, you're here, and you've been here all along. And they started to become the center of volunteering in that country, rather than large international volunteer sending organizations. So it's not that we can't have large volunteer sending organizations going from the global north to the global south. It has to be what we call a yes and it has to be that local, has to be really involved, and they have to be in the driver's seat, so to speak, for dictating how volunteering should be in their country. Finally, the COVID-19 really highlighted this advocacy laws around who's being discriminated when we volunteer. Whether it's sometimes the elderly, again, if during COVID-19, that became a very big issue. That because the vulnerability of the elderly population, many of the elderly were just said, no, you cannot volunteer. That was shocking. Instead of saying there are ways we can keep you safe and volunteer. It was just this blanket of no, you cannot. Also, a number of other categories and groups are discriminated, including people who perhaps are not born in a particular country and don't have a particular identification method. Sometimes these can be exclusionary. All of these got brought up. And this is why we call this transformative leadership during COVID-19. Because these volunteer leaders could have looked the other way on every single one of these issues. These issues were there before COVID-19, and they were there after. COVID-19 just lifted them up. And the volunteer leaders could have looked the other way and said, no, we're not going to go back. They took the opportunity to not just lead, but to transform. Okay. Supporting and developing others. This is a really big part of what our research found. So this notion of taking this opportunity, so we had government say, oh, we really value you, the private sector, we really value you. It became an issue of, okay, great, you value us, let's make sure we're putting in safeguarding, let's make sure volunteers are safe, and we have policies, and we have insurance. People, volunteer leaders took that opportunity to use their voice to advocate in that way. Developing quality standards, and again, really recognizing what we call community or local or informal volunteers. Volunteers who may never call themselves volunteers, but volunteers who are part of our everyday ecosystem of volunteering. Making sure that they are recognized and that their contributions are understood. All these became part of that supporting and developing others. Okay, showcasing creativity and innovation. Sometimes a crisis is the best time to innovate, because what you were doing, you can no longer do. And so you need to put your head up, and you need to think completely different ways to accomplish what you had been accomplishing. And that's what happened with volunteer organizations all around the world. They really became more accessible to volunteers, as we've talked about, with physical limitations. But they also developed what we call this digital, and I suppose everyone around this room knows what I'm talking about when I say virtual volunteering or digital volunteering. All of the things that, all of the programs that we were able to do through our phones and through our laptops and through our pads became accessible to everyone. And this is very important because it allowed many more people to volunteer. Because all you had to do was sit in front of your laptop or your phone, and you could be a volunteer. And that opened up volunteering, as I said, to many, many more people, that accessibility. And people who couldn't travel became able to volunteer, who couldn't even travel 2 or 3 streets away became able to volunteer. But we all know that's not enough, is it? I think we all maybe felt if you did practice digital volunteering or virtual volunteering, you may have enjoyed your experience, but I'm not sure it's entirely like an experience that you may have had if you were in the same room. And we also have to remember that there is this thing called a digital divide. Not every community has access to technology or access to the type of broadband that allows them to set up a volunteer, to put their programs online. And also, it must be said that not all volunteering can be done online. And so while virtual volunteering is important, it doesn't solve all the problems. Finally, greater youth engagement. So this is where I said how the elderly were prevented because they were perceived as being in the highest risk category. The opposite was true for youth. And youth became really a force for change in volunteering all across the world during the pandemic because they were perceived at less of a risk. And they really could volunteer in previously where there had not been a space perhaps for them. People actively reached out to youth. And I think this is really, really important for us as we think about the next generation and intergenerational volunteering. I heard someone say in our World Volunteer Conference last week that we must empower youth. And I don't think that's true. I think youth already have power. What we must do is we must recognize it and we must envelop together systems that are youth-centered and youth-led, and also intergenerational. I think it would be a missed opportunity not to look at volunteers and the relationships and the connections that they have. So this became a really important part of volunteering, and that is not going to change as we go back to normal. Youth and youth volunteering will be a significant part of our volunteering. Okay. Just quickly, adapting to operations after the shutdown. So basically, digital technology became incredibly important, but it's complex, and not everyone has access to it. So you have the sort of plus and minus here. That there was some increased funding. Many governments gave funding to organizations, volunteer organizations, but many of these organizations were working 24/7. You didn't have the time to think about fundraising or where they were going to get funds. Partner organizations restructured to meet the demands of the lockdown, but again, costs increased to do that, and as we said, not all activities could be managed digitally. Okay, last one on this is leading change. So again, as I said, these volunteer leaders did not just take the opportunity to survive the pandemic, they changed. They took the pandemic as an opportunity to revisit issues that had already been there and to attempt to solve those issues. They worked on collaboration and they worked on inclusion. And again, there's a difference between just going like this and getting through, and saying, I'm going to look at everything. In this time of chaos and great change, I'm going to look at the problems that are not just related to COVID, but the problems that were there at the beginning. And that's what we call that transformational change. Okay, just very quickly, corporates, because I don't want to leave that out, because that was a really important part of what we saw. Corporations responded incredibly quickly and creatively to their volunteer programs. And they really set up volunteer programs almost overnight. It allowed them to volunteer closer to home, whereas many corporate programs were skills-based volunteering, sending employees around the globe. They really focused on volunteering closer to home and built those ties with their local community. It allowed employees to find that balance in a destabilized world. We were all very fearful, we were unsure, and as we all know, volunteering helps us feel better when we act and when we volunteer. And certainly that was true for corporations. And again, because much of it was virtual, it allowed employees who had never volunteered previously to volunteer. But it was difficult to initiate volunteer virtual programs. Many partners, NGO partners, didn't know how to do it, didn't have the capability. Technology was that barrier. Volunteering oftentimes in the private sector is used for team building. And all that went away because each individual employee was sitting in front of their monitor at home. And also, there was an initial increase in volunteering from employees, but then as Zoom fatigue set in, it really did wane, and people started to just be tired of working all day in front of a laptop, switching off, and then spending another hour volunteering on a laptop. Okay, I'm going to switch now to taking this into what I call the global trends. So all of what I've just said, I'm now going to come back to 6 global trends. As we were doing that study, the United Nations volunteers also, UNV, also issued their State of the World Volunteering Report. And another organization, global organization, issued its volunteering report. And so what we did is took all 3 of these reports, put them together, and looked for what they each said as the global trend for the future of volunteering. So number 1, there needs to be a broader recognition of who volunteers are. Again, those people who would never call themselves a volunteer, people who use their voice, or people who use their talent or their treasure in ways that are not connected to formal volunteering, need to be at least recognized when we think about the volunteer ecosystem. And of course, this notion of an accelerated youth volunteerism and an accelerated private sector volunteerism. All 3 of those have to be understood better if we are to build catalytic volunteering programs into the future. Global trend number 2. We must be inclusive as we volunteer. We must bridge barriers to what we call marginalized groups who have not been invited into our volunteering programs previously. We must recognize that there are differences. We understand volunteers differently, and we place different values on different volunteers. That maybe we think that the tech wizard who comes from Microsoft is more valuable than the 15-year-old who wishes to dedicate her time painting a classroom. We tell ourselves that the first one is more valuable than the second one. That's not true. They're all valuable because volunteering is about changing the world, and each one of those people has a role to play. So we must really understand that, and understand that everyone who volunteers is of equal importance. And that volunteering is a route to what we call inclusive social change. I like to say, people don't paint classrooms because they want to change the color of the classroom. They paint classrooms because they care about education, and they care about the value of their child's education. And they want to make sure that their child gets the education that she or he deserved. So when we volunteer, we are tackling large issues, and we're engaged in these issues as advocates, as advocates for solutions. So we must not be afraid to connect what we're doing to these larger social issues. When you clean up a river, you are helping climate change, because you are helping to restore the health of that river. So these little actions do add up to big social change. And we must make sure that we connect that, and we must make sure never to be afraid to understand our role in these larger systems of social change. Okay, trend number 3. Yes, technology is an enabler. None of us can get through the day without our phones. Mine is upstairs somewhere, and I'm very nervous about that, because I have it by my side, because that's how we all live these days. It is an enabler. It is also a way to disconnect. And I think everyone knows what I mean when I say that we can sit on our phones for hours and not connect with those around us. So volunteering, using technology to volunteer, is an enabler, and we can do magical things when we volunteer online. We can tutor children half around the world. We can find missing maps to key environmental ecosystems from our living rooms, and we can do amazing things. But not everybody can do it. Not everybody has the access. Not everybody is able to. So we just must remember that. And as I like to say, it's a yes and. Yes to technology, but also very much yes to in-person. Very much yes to continuing to meet one another in the same room. We just came from the World Volunteer Conference where over 1,000 of us from all over the world met. And I can tell you that while technology is revolutionary, meeting face-to-face is the magic. So we must never forget that. All right, almost done. Deeper, as I said, government and private sector in volunteering. Everybody has a role to play here, right? And so we must work with our governments. I think we do a far better job here in this country than in many other countries working with government. You see that right in this room, how hard you have worked and how good of a job you do. But not other countries like that. In fact, most countries, voluntary sector is here and government is here. We must change that because, again, we want volunteers involved in government response. Same thing with the private sector. The private sector is moving from volunteering as a way to check a box to volunteering as a way to deliver social change and meet their company's agenda. And we must really, really value volunteering with solid funding from the private sector and government, again, globally. I talked a lot about partnerships and cooperation, but this is very much a key to the future. As the African saying goes, if you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And that is very much what is at heart here. We are not able to solve these problems by ourselves, so we must work collaboratively to do so. Finally, the sixth and last global trend that we saw from all three of these reports is that notion of shared action and making sure that volunteering isn't just considered a nice thing, but a thing that is essential for society. And so that when you say, I am a volunteer, people maybe don't say, oh, that's so nice, but they say, wow, thank you. Thank you for your work, and thank you for your dedication to the community. So again, the new normal of volunteering, it will be inclusive, it will be local, as well as national, as well as international. It will focus on digitization, but it will always remember